What would you do if your deepest prejudice landed you in the worst place imaginable? Could you survive when your beliefs make you the enemy? In this gripping tale, we reveal the shocking story of a racist sent to Alcatraz, a prison dominated by black inmates, where every moment becomes a fight for survival. Inside these cold walls, his hatred turns into his greatest weakness, leading to a shocking and unforgettable lesson. This isn't just a story about prejudice. It's about the consequences of one's actions. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories like this. Quick question. Which city are you tuning in from? Drop it below, we're curious. The rusted iron gates of Alcatraz loomed large as the transport bus came to a screeching halt. The sound of chains rattling filled the tense air as a lone prisoner, pale and trembling, was escorted off the bus. His name was Martin Green, a man in his late 40s, with thinning blonde hair and a demeanor that exuded arrogance and fear all at once. Martin's crime wasn't just the fraud that had landed him here, it was the hate that had defined his life. A former small-town leader of a radical group, Martin had made a name for himself spewing vitriol and spreading division. Now he was about to face the ultimate reckoning. The guards barely glanced at Martin as they processed him, their cold efficiency a stark contrast to the fear radiating from his every pore. He could feel the sweat dripping down his back as the reality of his situation sank in. Alcatraz wasn't just any prison. It was a facility known for housing some of the most hardened and dangerous criminals in the country. And for Martin, the danger wasn't just in the walls themselves. It was in the inmates who waited inside. As Martin was led through the dimly lit corridors, the noise hit him first, the sound of laughter, arguments, and occasional clanging of metal. Then came the stairs. Row after row of cells filled with black inmates, their eyes narrowing as Martin passed. He could feel the weight of their glares, a mix of curiosity and hostility. The guards said nothing as they escorted him to his cell, but Martin could hear murmurs as the inmates leaned against the bars, their expressions unreadable, but their intent clear. Martin didn't need to hear the words to understand what they were thinking. He had spent years preaching hate against people like them, and now he was in their territory. The cell door slammed shut behind him with a metallic clang that echoed through the block. Martin sat on the edge of the narrow cot, his hands trembling as he tried to collect his thoughts. "Just keep your head down," he muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. But even as he said it, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. His reputation had preceded him. Word traveled fast in places like this, and it wouldn't be long before everyone knew who he was and what he stood for. The first confrontation came faster than Martin expected. As the inmates were let out of their cells for recreation, he tried to blend into the crowd, keeping his head low and avoiding eye contact. But it was no use. A group of men approached him, their leader a towering figure named Malik, whose presence was both commanding and intimidating. "So, you're the one they've been talking about," Malik said, his voice low but carrying an edge of menace. "The big man with the big mouth." Martin didn't respond, but the silence only seemed to provoke Malik further. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Malik's friends chuckled, their laughter sharp and mocking. Martin felt his throat tighten, his pulse quickening as the reality of his situation came crashing down. He was outnumbered, out of his element, and completely at their mercy. As the tension escalated, a guard's whistle broke the moment, signaling the end of recreation time. Martin exhaled shakily, retreating to the relative safety of his cell. But he knew this was only the beginning. In a place like Alcatraz, there were no second chances. And for a man like Martin, surrounded by those he had spent a lifetime vilifying, survival would mean confronting not just his circumstances, but also himself. Martin barely slept that first night. The hard cot beneath him and the echoing sounds of Alcatraz, muffled conversations, the occasional clanging of metal, and the distant shouting of guards, kept him on edge. But the real torment came from his thoughts. His mind replayed Malik's mocking words on a loop, each repetition driving home the same chilling truth. Martin was not just an outsider here. He was the enemy. This wasn't a prison of stone and iron for him. It was a cage of his own making, constructed over years of hate and ignorance. The next morning came too quickly. marked by the harsh clang of metal as the guards banged on the cell bars. "Rise and shine, Green," one of them barked, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Time to meet the rest of the crew." Martin hesitated but forced himself to his feet. He could feel the weight of his new reality pressing down on him with every step he took out of the cell and into the dimly lit corridor. The cafeteria was his next hurdle. The room was a cacophony of voices and clinking metal trays, filled with clusters of inmates gathered in their self-formed groups. As Martin stepped in, the noise seemed to dip slightly, and dozens of eyes turned toward him. His instinct was to retreat, but the guard's presence and the steady push of the line behind him left no room for escape. Tray in hand, he scanned the room for a place to sit. Most tables were full, and those that weren't seemed to close ranks as he approached. It was a silent but clear message. "You're not welcome here." Martin eventually found a spot at an empty table in the corner, his heart pounding as he sat down. He barely managed a few bites of the bland food before a shadow loomed over him. Malik. The towering figure stood across from Martin, holding his tray with one hand while the other rested casually on the edge of the table. Behind him, 3 of his men hovered, their postures relaxed, but their eyes sharp and alert. "You think this is your spot now?" Malik asked, his voice deceptively calm. Martin glanced up but said nothing, unsure of how to respond. Malik smirked. "Didn't think so." With a subtle motion of his head, he signaled for his men, who slid onto the bench beside Martin, crowding him in. Malik sat across from him, his tray clattering loudly against the table. For a few excruciating moments, no one spoke. The other inmates in the cafeteria pretended not to notice, but Martin could feel their stolen glances. The tension was suffocating. Malik finally broke the silence. "You don't belong here," he said, his tone measured but carrying an unmistakable threat. "But I'm guessing you already figured that out." Martin swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I'm just trying to do my time," he managed, his voice shaky but audible. Malik leaned back, studying him with a critical eye. "Your time?" he repeated, as if testing the words. "See, here's the thing. In this place, time isn't just something you serve. It's something you survive. And survival? That depends on whose side you're on." Martin felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't naive. He understood the unspoken offer being made: fall in line or be crushed. But before he could respond, one of Malik's men chuckled darkly. "What side are you even talking about? He's got no side." The comment stung, not because it was untrue, but because it hit so close to the heart of Martin's predicament. He had spent years carving out a side for himself in the world, one defined by exclusion and division. But here, in Alcatraz, that side didn't exist. He was alone, untethered, and vulnerable. Malik didn't press further. Instead, he stood abruptly, his tray in hand. "Think about it," he said, his tone as casual as if they were discussing the weather. Then, with a pointed glance at Martin, he added, "But don't take too long." The group left, their departure as deliberate and menacing as their arrival. For the rest of the day, Martin kept his head down, avoiding eye contact and interaction wherever possible. But the weight of Malik's words lingered. Whose side was he on? Did he even deserve a side? These questions gnawed at him, challenging the very foundation of who he thought he was. Later, during yard time, Martin found a quiet corner and sat on a low bench, his eyes fixed on the concrete beneath his feet. The other inmates moved around him like sharks circling prey, their interactions fluid but edged with tension. He could feel their eyes on him, some curious, others judgmental. A few inmates laughed loudly in his direction, but Martin didn't look up. He couldn't risk provoking anyone, not now. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, Martin noticed a small group playing basketball nearby. The players moved with practiced ease, their laughter and camaraderie cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. For a fleeting moment, Martin felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Envy, perhaps, or longing. He had spent so much of his life building walls, isolating himself from others. But here, in the stark reality of Alcatraz, he was beginning to understand the price of that isolation. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp whistle of a guard, signaling the end of yard time. As Martin stood to leave, he caught Malik's gaze from across the yard. The towering man watched him for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Martin didn't know what it meant, but it left him unsettled. Back in his cell that night, he lay awake, his mind racing. The rules of survival in Alcatraz were becoming clear, but the cost of following them was something he wasn't sure he could bear. The next morning, Martin awoke to the sound of boots echoing through the corridors as the guards barked out instructions. Everyone up. Yard cleanup duty. The routine had become familiar, but each day felt like a new test of survival. As the cell doors creaked open, Martin joined the line of inmates, shuffling toward the yard, his shoulders tense with anticipation. The whispers from the previous day still clung to him, and Malik's cryptic nod haunted his thoughts. What did it mean? Was it a warning, an acknowledgement, or something worse? As the inmates dispersed into the yard, Martin found himself assigned to a section near the fence, tasked with clearing debris. The work was monotonous but offered a small relief. It kept him away from most of the other inmates. Yet, as he crouched to pick up a piece of broken glass, he felt the familiar sensation of being watched. Turning his head slightly, he saw Malik and his group leaning against a wall, their eyes locked on him. They weren't speaking, but their expressions spoke volumes. Martin's heart raced. He quickly returned to his task, hoping to appear indifferent, though every fiber of his being screamed to run. After an hour of silent labor, the guards signaled for a break. Martin wiped his brow, the sun beating down mercilessly. He considered retreating to a quiet corner, but before he could move, Malik approached. This time, he wasn't alone. His group followed closely, their presence an unspoken threat. Malik stopped a few feet away, his hands casually resting in his pockets. "You're a hard worker, Green," Malik said, his tone almost conversational. "But I'm starting to wonder if you're a fast learner." Martin straightened, trying to appear composed despite the knot tightening in his stomach. "I'm just trying to stay out of trouble," he replied cautiously. Malik smirked, his gaze unwavering. "Trouble doesn't care if you're looking for it or not, it finds you anyway." He took a step closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over Martin. "And right now, trouble's got its eyes on you." The men around Malik chuckled, their laughter low and menacing. Martin's instincts told him to de-escalate, to say something that would placate the group, but the weight of their stares, combined with the oppressive atmosphere of the yard, left him momentarily paralyzed. "I don't want any problems," Martin finally said, his voice steady but quieter than he intended. Malik studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. Then maybe you'll listen," he gestured to the men behind him. "These guys? They've got my back. That's how we survive in here. But you..." Malik paused, his smirk fading. "You're alone, and in a place like this, that's the same as being dead." The words hit Martin harder than he expected. He knew they were true. Every glance, every whispered word, every sidelong smirk from the other inmates had confirmed it. He was an outsider, a target. Malik's offer, though laced with menace, carried a brutal honesty. But joining him? Aligning himself with someone like Malik felt like a betrayal of everything Martin thought he stood for. "I'll think about it," Martin said, his voice barely audible. Malik raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Don't take too long," he said, turning to leave. "Time's not on your side." His group followed, their laughter echoing in the yard. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Martin kept his head down, avoiding further confrontations, but Malik's words lingered in his mind, gnawing at him like a relentless itch. That night, as he lay on his cot staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that his time was running out. Malik wasn't just offering protection, he was offering survival. And in a place like Alcatraz, survival wasn't guaranteed. The following day brought a new challenge, a game of basketball in the yard. The guards had set it up as a way to keep the peace, though everyone knew it was just another opportunity for tensions to boil over. Martin watched from the sidelines, hesitant to join. But when one of the guards barked at him to participate, he had no choice. Reluctantly, he stepped onto the cracked concrete court, his presence drawing stares from both teams. The game began, and it quickly became clear that this was no friendly match. Players jostled and shoved, their movements aggressive and calculated. Martin did his best to keep up, but his lack of familiarity with the court and the unspoken alliances among the players put him at a disadvantage. Within minutes, he was knocked to the ground, the ball bouncing out of reach. "Stay down where you belong," one of the players sneered as he stepped over Martin. Laughter rippled through the court, but it was short-lived. Malik, who had been watching from the sidelines, stood abruptly and strode onto the court. The other players fell silent as he approached, his presence commanding attention. "Game's over," Malik said, his voice low but firm. "Get out of here." The players hesitated but eventually dispersed, leaving Martin sitting on the ground, his pride as battered as his body. Malik extended a hand, his expression unreadable. "You've got guts," Malik said as Martin hesitated before accepting the help. "But guts won't keep you alive here." Martin wanted to respond, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. He let Malik pull him to his feet, the two of them standing face to face for a moment. "Think about what I said," Malik added before turning to leave. Over the next few days, Martin found himself increasingly torn. Malik's offer loomed over him like a shadow, its implications both enticing and terrifying. To accept would mean safety, but at what cost? To refuse would mean isolation, and in Alcatraz, isolation was a death sentence. As the week progressed, Martin noticed a subtle shift in the way the other inmates treated him. Some watched him more closely, their curiosity mingled with suspicion. Others seemed emboldened, their hostility more overt. It was as if they were waiting for him to make a choice, to declare which side he was on, and the longer he hesitated, the more dangerous the situation became. One evening, as Martin sat alone in his cell, he heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, he saw Malik standing at the bars, his expression serious. "Time's up, Green," Malik said. "You in or out?" Martin's heart pounded in his chest. He knew this was a turning point, a decision that would define not just his time in Alcatraz, but who he was as a person. Swallowing hard, he met Malik's gaze, his mind racing. "I'm in," Martin said finally, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. Malik nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Good. Let's see if you're worth it." As Malik walked away, Martin sat back on his cot, the weight of his decision settling over him like a heavy blanket. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: survival in Alcatraz had just taken on a whole new meaning. The days that followed Martin's decision to align himself with Malik were unlike anything he'd experienced before. The first thing he noticed was the shift in how the other inmates treated him. The sneering glares didn't disappear entirely, but there was now an air of caution in how people approached him. Or more accurately, didn't approach him. Malik's reputation as a dominant force within Alcatraz had afforded Martin a shield of sorts. For the first time since his arrival, he wasn't completely alone. But with that newfound safety came a cost, and Martin was about to learn just how steep that price could be. It started small. Errands that seemed insignificant but carried a heavy implication. "Take this to cell block D," Malik had said one morning, handing Martin a package wrapped in newspaper. He didn't ask what was inside, and Malik didn't offer any explanation. Martin simply nodded, his grip tightening around the parcel as he navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the prison. Along the way, he caught glimpses of other inmates, their eyes narrowing as they noticed him carrying something on behalf of Malik. By the time he reached his destination and handed the package to a gruff-looking man named June, Martin's nerves were frayed. June barely acknowledged him, snatching the package with a curt nod before disappearing into his cell. Back in his own cell later that evening, Martin replayed the interaction in his mind. Was this what he had signed up for? Running errands, being a pawn in someone else's game? But as he lay on his cot, staring at the cracked ceiling, he realized he didn't have the luxury of questioning his role. Malik had given him a lifeline, and in Alcatraz, lifelines weren't free. The true test of Martin's loyalty came during a seemingly routine moment in the yard. It was a crisp, overcast afternoon, and the inmates were scattered across the concrete expanse, some playing basketball, others chatting in clusters. Martin was sitting on a low bench near the fence when he noticed Malik and his crew gathered near the center of the yard. Their postures were tense, their eyes locked on another group of inmates, standing a few feet away. The air between the two groups crackled with unspoken hostility. As Martin watched, one of Malik's men, a wiry, sharp-tongued guy named Day, stepped forward, his voice carrying across the yard. "You got something to say, Kang?" he called out, addressing the leader of the opposing group. Kang, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his left cheek, smirked. "Just wondering why you're still walking around like you own this place," he replied, his tone laced with challenge. The tension escalated quickly. Malik stepped forward, his towering presence silencing the murmurs around the yard. "Careful, Kang," he said evenly. "You don't want to start something you can't finish." Kang chuckled, but his expression darkened. "Maybe I do." Before anyone could react, Kang's group surged forward, and chaos erupted. Fists flew, shouts echoed off the concrete walls, and guards scrambled to intervene. Martin froze, unsure of what to do. He saw Malik in the thick of it, grappling with Kang, their movements a blur of aggression. Then he saw Day, pinned to the ground by two of Kang's men, his face contorted in pain. Without thinking, Martin rushed forward, adrenaline propelling him into the fray. He grabbed one of the men holding Day and yanked him backward, the momentum sending the man stumbling. The second man turned on Martin, his fist connecting with Martin's jaw in a burst of pain. Martin staggered but didn't fall. Instead, he swung back, his punch landing squarely on the man's stomach. The impact was enough to knock the wind out of him, and he crumpled to the ground. Day scrambled to his feet, blood trickling from his nose, and gave Martin a quick nod of thanks before joining the fight once more. By the time the guards restored order, several inmates were bloodied and bruised, and Martin's knuckles ached from the blows he'd landed. He stood to the side, breathing heavily as the guards herded the combatants back into their cells. Malik caught his eye as they passed, giving him a subtle nod of approval. For the first time, Martin felt a flicker of belonging. He had proved himself, not just to Malik, but to the group as a whole. But the satisfaction was short-lived. That night, as he lay in his cell, the weight of what he'd done settled over him. Violence had never been his way, and yet here he was, throwing punches in a prison yard brawl. What was he becoming? The days turned into weeks, and Martin found himself increasingly entangled in Malik's world. He ran more errands, each one more suspicious than the last. He played lookout during hushed meetings in the shadows of the cell block, and though he tried to keep his head down, he couldn't ignore the whispers that followed him wherever he went. Some inmates regarded him with newfound respect. Others saw him as a traitor, a sellout who had traded his soul for protection. One afternoon, as he was delivering a package to a guard who clearly had his own questionable alliances, Martin overheard a snippet of conversation that sent a chill down his spine. "The warden's cracking down," the guard muttered, glancing around nervously. "He's on to Malik's crew. If you're smart, you'll distance yourself." Martin's stomach churned. If the warden was watching, that meant Malik's operation was under threat, and by extension, so was Martin. He returned to his cell, his mind racing. Was there a way out of this? Could he distance himself without incurring Malik's wrath? The thought seemed impossible. Malik wasn't the kind of man you walked away from. That evening, Malik called a meeting in the common area. His crew gathered around him, their faces grim. "We've got a rat," Malik announced, his voice cold and measured. The room fell silent. Martin's pulse quickened as Malik's gaze swept over the group. "Someone's been talking to the guards," he continued, "and if we don't handle it, they'll come for all of us." The accusation hung heavy in the air. Martin's mind raced. Was this a test? Did Malik suspect him? Or was this about someone else entirely? Either way, the stakes had never been higher. Malik's eyes locked on Martin, and for a moment the world seemed to freeze. Then Malik's lips curved into a faint smile. "Green," he said, "you've got a good head on your shoulders. Find out who the rat is." Martin's breath caught. The room seemed to spin as the weight of Malik's words settled over him. He had been given a task that would either cement his place in Malik's world or mark the beginning of his downfall. The question was, how far was he willing to go to survive? The pressure of Malik's assignment weighed heavily on Martin's shoulders. Each passing hour felt like a countdown to an inevitable disaster. The question of loyalty haunted him. Loyalty to Malik, to himself, and to the fragile sense of survival he'd pieced together in Alcatraz. As he moved through the prison's corridors, every glance, every whispered conversation seemed like a potential clue, or worse, a trap. Martin knew that if he failed to uncover the so-called rat, Malik would turn his suspicion inward. And failure in Malik's world wasn't an option. Martin began his search carefully, speaking with those he thought might have information while trying to avoid raising suspicion. His conversations were short, often cloaked in casual small talk. "Hear anything interesting lately?" he'd ask, his tone light but his eyes sharp. Most inmates shrugged him off, their survival instincts urging them to stay out of Malik's affairs. But one name kept surfacing in hushed tones: June, the gruff man Martin had once delivered a package to. The revelation sent a chill through Martin. June had always seemed distant, but now his silence felt calculated. Martin's next steps would determine everything. He found June in the yard one afternoon, sitting alone on a bench, his face unreadable. Gathering his courage, Martin approached, his heart pounding. "June," he began, keeping his voice steady, "we need to talk." June looked up, his expression calm but guarded. "About what?" he asked, his tone flat. Martin hesitated, then leaned closer. "Malik thinks there's a rat," he said quietly, "and your name keeps coming up." For a moment, June said nothing. Then he chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Of course it does," he muttered. "That's how this place works. Everyone's a suspect." "Is it true?" Martin pressed, his voice barely above a whisper. He hated the desperation in his tone but couldn't help it. His survival depended on the answer. June met Martin's gaze, his eyes tired but resolute. "Let me tell you something, Green," he said. "In a place like this, everyone's just trying to survive. Some do it by following the rules, some do it by breaking them, and some—" he paused, his expression hardening— "some do it by throwing others under the bus." Martin's stomach twisted. He couldn't tell if June was confessing or deflecting. But before he could press further, a commotion erupted nearby. Two inmates had started a fight, drawing the attention of the guards. June used the distraction to slip away, leaving Martin alone with more questions than answers. That night, Malik cornered Martin in the common area, his expression dark. "Well?" he demanded. "What did you find out?" Martin hesitated, his mind racing. He could name June and hope it was the right call, or he could admit he wasn't sure and risk Malik's wrath. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, and for a moment, he felt paralyzed. But then he remembered June's words, "Everyone's just trying to survive." Taking a deep breath, Martin looked Malik in the eye. "It's June," he said firmly. "He's the one." Malik studied him for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Then he nodded. "Good," he said. "We'll take care of it." As Malik walked away, Martin felt a wave of relief mixed with dread. He had made his choice, but the consequences were far from over. The next morning, June was gone, transferred to solitary confinement under the pretense of disciplinary action. The whispers among the inmates were deafening. Some suspected the truth, while others stayed silent, unwilling to get involved. For Martin, the realization was bitter. In protecting himself, he had become part of the very system he despised. In the days that followed, Malik's crew treated Martin with more respect, their subtle nods and occasional words of praise reinforcing his new status. But Martin couldn't shake the guilt that clung to him like a shadow. He had survived, yes, but at what cost? Each time he passed June's empty cell, he was reminded of the price of his choices. Alcatraz had changed him, stripped him of the man he once was, and replaced him with someone he barely recognized. As Martin sat on his cot one evening, staring out at the dim corridor beyond his cell, he felt a strange sense of clarity. Alcatraz wasn't just a prison of concrete and steel. It was a mirror, reflecting the darkest parts of everyone inside. And in that mirror, Martin saw a man who had learned to survive, but had lost something far more valuable: his humanity. The clang of the guards' boots echoed through the cell block, signaling lights out. Martin lay back, closing his eyes, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Survival in Alcatraz had taught him many things, but the lesson he would never forget was the one etched deep into his soul. In a place built on fear and power, the cost of survival was everything.